So it just continue, it says.
There you go.
Okay, good.
Hello.
Hello, good afternoon.
Yes, afternoon actually for both of us. So that's nice.
What time is it in Mexico?
It's 5:15 here in Durango.
Uh-huh, okay. I thought I said Dorado, it's Durango. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So to start off with, would you just like to say your name, where you are?
Sure. I'm Bob Resnick. I'm in Los Angeles, California. And I am in my office, which fortunately is only 2 blocks from where I live. And I wanted to sit in a comfortable chair and have a big screen for this interview, so I didn't do it at home on a laptop, sitting on a dining room chair.
Nice. Well, welcome to my office in Durango. I'm also in my comfy chair.
Good.
So the first question that I have for you, and you can take this however you want, is who are you? If you'd like to say a little bit about yourself as a person, interests, passions, qualities, anything other than a curriculum, basically.
Okay. I've watched a couple of the interviews that you and Kamala have done. And what I noticed is that the question is very wide and cuts across many domains, that I could answer it in terms of I'm a human, I'm a man, or I could answer it in terms of roles. I'm a father, I'm a husband, or I could answer it in terms of career, I'm a therapist, etc. So if I sift through that and just what's important to me, what's important to me is being a father. What's important to me is being a husband. The connection is what's important to me. And that, of course, leads right to Gestalt therapy. That for me, the basic human dilemma, as I've said for many years now, is how to be connected to an other and maintain a self. And that's a constant movement in order to keep balance. And that the withdrawal is just as important as the contact. And connection includes contact, withdrawal, and movement in between. So I'm attracted to connection. So as a father and as a grandfather, I love it. As a husband, as a friend, those are the things that are really primary in terms of values and importance to me. And of course, that influences my attraction to Gestalt therapy and what's important there. Gestalt therapy is one of my biggest passions. Both distilling and integrating theory and clinical work and having them inform each other. I don't care much about theory that doesn't inform clinical work. It may be interesting intellectually, but it has little to do with therapy if it doesn't inform the work. That's one passion. The other passion is all the decades that I've been involved in developing a model of primary relationships, which then informs a model of couples therapy. So that's a lot.
It's a lot, and it sounds a lot like you, what I know of you. Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, and so maybe this next question, since it is relational, is relevant there to connection, which would be, what other person, and of course there's more than one, there's a whole lifetime of relationships, but who do you think has had the most impact on who you are as a person?
There are quite a few. Certainly my mother is one. My first therapist was one. In fact, I in the credits, I thank Fritz Perls and Jim Simkin, who were my major mentors, and Francis DeBillio, who was my first therapist. And interestingly, I didn't know it at the time, of course, he had studied at the William Allison White Institute, which was, it's Sullivanian mostly in orientation, and that was the only place in New York that Fritz was welcome. Karen Horney brought him there, and Fritz did many presentations at the William Allison White Institute. So Frank DeBillio had some of that flavor, and I didn't even know it at the time. I was, I guess, in my early 20s at that time. Yeah, around early 20s. My mother, Frank DeBillio, Fritz, of course, and Jim Simkin. Those are probably the major influences that impact and changing my life.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to say anything to how any of those particular people influenced you?
Well, yes, I can do that. The first time I walked into Frank DeBillio's office, and there was a couch because he was an analyst, but he didn't act like one. And I didn't know, so I said to him, "Am I supposed to lie down on the couch?" And he said with a twinkle, not with any edge or anything, he said, "Are you tired?" So I laughed, and I knew I liked him already. He had just that lovely balance of the twinkle that was warm and friendly and the edge that let me know, hey, that's up to you. What do you want? So it was lovely. So he had a really big influence on me in finding my way as a young guy. Fritz and Jim, what the impact on me was through Gestalt therapy, which is why I found a home, is it allowed me to be me. I had been trained in psychoanalytic, I had been trained in kind of quasi-existential, social learning theory, behaviorism, and in all of those places, I was playing a role, and I was doing an internship at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute, which was medical, wearing a white coat and being told essentially to play doctor. And here I was not only told to be me, but I was tapped on the shoulder and sometimes gently nudged in the butt if I wasn't being me. That was just a terrific thing. And it just opened up the world to me, that I can actually do therapy without having to put on a restrictive role of playing doctor or playing expert or playing anything. That with clinical judgment, it's not just wide open, but with clinical judgment to be able to be there as I am. And interesting, what I've been recently talking to some pretty experienced Gestalt therapist in supervision, that the theory that you have absorbed and assimilated is in you. So that when you're working well, I know when I'm working well, I'm not thinking theory at all. It's in me, I've assimilated it. So since it's me, not you, we're gonna look different. And that's not only okay, I'd be suspect if you looked a lot like me, or if I looked a lot like you, because then it's interjecting a clone. And I'm going to be a very second-rate Heather, and you're going to be a second-rate Bob. So that to be who you are with the clinical judgment, which I can talk about what that's involved for, is just a breath of fresh air. And I would have been bored or gone nuts decades ago had I not had that impact and support from Jim and from Fritz.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I would be a pretty horrible Bob. I don't know if I could do that. I really don't think I could pull it off. And I understand that. That's a very meaningful kind of impact, yeah, to let somebody be. So another question that I would have is, I guess this is the field theory question. What event or circumstance would you say has shaped who you are as a person? Any particular moment or set of circumstances in the course of your life that has really marked you?
Yes. Certainly having kids and then having grandkids. That's just lovely and beautiful. without times as well as being a pain in the ass, but just lovely. In terms of events that were more between me and them, whoever the other was, there are many of them within Gestalt therapy and within my relationship with Fritz and my relationship with Jim. I just wrote a chapter in the Psychopathology of Awareness. It's a new book commenting by 10 or 12 authors, Gestalt people, that Charlie Bowman and Jean-Marie Robin are the editors. And I talked about some of those stories and stories of how I was affected. One of them was when Fritz asked me if I would introduce Gestalt therapy to Europe. That was in 1969. That was a mandate that just opened up the world for me. And I've been going to Europe 3 times a year for several weeks each time, doing training, showing my work publicly, both to people who were already kind of preaching to the choir and people who came in, yeah, let's see, and people who came in looking to, how can I nail this guy? And doing that for the last 50 years is an unbelievable opportunity. I mean, who has that opportunity to be able to be seen and to learn from the feedback and the impact on people from different orientations and from different levels of, sometimes they're really interested and sometimes they were just looking to be critical. So that was a wonderful, wonderful event that just had ripples and still does in my life. The other one was Fritz. Actually, there were 3 with Fritz. 2 of them I followed. The other one I said, no way. The second one that I followed is I was sitting with Fritz in my old Volvo, which I still have, 1964. I have newer cars too, but I still have that car. And I had been driving him for a couple of things, and we were sitting there, and I said to him, you know, I'm seeing a couple now, and I noticed you don't say anything about that, and there's nothing much in the literature about that. And Fritz looked at me and kind of blushed a little bit. At least I thought he did, I don't know. And he looked sheepish and he said, I'm not very good at that. Which, no shit, Sherlock. He wasn't very good at that, just ask Laura. But he said to me then, if that interests you, that would be a good thing for you to do. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, to organize Gestalt concepts to relationships and primary relationships. And I said, you got it. And I took it as a very serious mandate, not an imperative, but a mandate to do that.
Yeah, you really ran with that one.
Yes, yes. And I've been developing that model for 50 years. And we just have some new couples films out for the first time as well. So those were the 2 that he said that I really liked and that I followed through on. And I'm still following through on them. The third one, I'll just do it briefly. I only came back to LA after my internship in LA at UCLA. Then I went back to the university to finish my PhD thesis. And then I came back only for 1 year to study with Fritz and Jim. I've been here since it's now 52 years, 53 years. I'm a little late after that year, but at that time I thought it was 1 year that I was going to stay in California. And so Fritz was talking to me about when I go back to New York. And he said, when you go back to New York, you will start an institute, a training institute. And I said, wait a minute, Fritz. I said, I am not going to just go back there and start another institute in competition in some way with Laura. By the way, I don't see that as competition anymore, but that's another story. I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to ask Laura to meet with me, and I'm going to try and see if we can find a way to work together. I want to learn from her. And I said, I obviously am bringing some different stuff to her as well. And he said, no, 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 you start your own. And I looked at him and I said, Fritz, you fight with your own wife. I'm not getting involved in that. And he laughed and he squeezed my hand because he knew damn well that's exactly what he was doing.
Yeah.
So I didn't follow that one.
Mm-hmm.
Discrimination.
Nice. Yes. Well, and you know, it's also, I would imagine, applying some of your own principles from the second point, right? Like you can see couples dynamics, you know what you're going to get into, you know what you don't want to play with.
Yes, but I didn't know that then.
Okay.
I wasn't going to fight with his wife for him, you know, like right. He had some agenda there that had more to do with that, I think, than with getting his organization of Gestalt therapy spoken for in New York.
Of course. Right. Well, this is sort of a personalized question because I can't ask people who don't have their own training centers what your experience has been co-creating, because I know it's not just you, your own sort of educational community. You didn't follow that tip to go and do it in New York, but how has that been for you? What is your, I mean, I can't really ask you to sort of sum up the entire GATLA experience.
Yeah. Well, it's good and bad. It's of course sweet and sour. We started with Jim and Fritz. We started the Gestalt Institute of LA in 1969, and we started training then. And at that time, Fritz was still planning on opening up a center. He actually, I saw the plans. He bought land on Pico Boulevard, and he had plans, and even in 69, he had plans that included TV cameras in every therapy room, and it was building from scratch. It never happened, and I think they got into a fight after he died about who owns the land, but that's peripheral. But we started the Gestalt Institute of LA, and we went on, and we started our summer program. We didn't know it would be more than a one-time thing in 1972, our first summer residential in Europe. Next year is our 50th, our golden anniversary that we're celebrating. We had to cancel this year, this July. First time ever we've canceled. So the Gestalt Institute of LA started, and we did quite well and enjoyed it. And I mean, we had our issues in the faculty. And then unfortunately, like in most places, there was some split, some difficulties, and we tried, we meaning myself and Rita and Todd Burley and the other faculty, we really tried to see if we could find a way, because we wanted to be in dialogue, all of us. Well, we stayed too damn long, all of us. We spent 7 years trying to make it work until, I mean, we brought in Gestalt consultants. We brought in non-Gestalt consultants. We met privately, small, but one-on-one. We met leaderless in a group. We spent time and money. And finally, after 7 years, we said, you know what? I think we just have to surrender to the reality that we're not compatible. And we split up. And so 1997, I think that was. So we have two Gestalt training organizations, the Pacific Gestalt Institute, which was started by Gary Yontif and Lynn Jacobs, and GATLA, Gestalt Associates Training LA, which was essentially myself, Todd Burley, and Rita. So, and we're both doing programs. They have a training program in LA. We have a training program. We even have a client, not a client, a trainee, who asked me, and she was interested in both. And she said, could I go to both? I said, great idea. So she's currently going to both programs, and hopefully will make her own integration of what fits, because we do have some theoretical differences. They're not huge, but they're significant. So the one more piece on that, the summer program was one of our faculty, Janet Rainwater. Janet was a political activist in the last 20 years, 30 years for Nicaragua, mostly. She died a few years ago. And she wanted to go to a communist country. She wanted to see what that was like. And the only one she could possibly get us into was, at the time, Yugoslavia. So she asked the faculty who would be willing and interested in being involved in doing that. So Bob Martin, who was one of the faculty, and myself are the only two that said they were interested. So in 1972, we did a program in the south part of Yugoslavia, which is now Montenegro. And we had no idea it was going to go on for 50 years. People wanted more, and it grew. And it stays alive and fresh because we take feedback seriously. We really read it, we really talk to people, and we make changes, because what fits this year, 3 years from now, doesn't fit anymore. Different people with some different needs and different nuances. So it didn't start as a series, it started as a one-time event, and it ended up going, as I said, be our 50th anniversary.
Mm. Wow. Hmm. So one thing that we do sometimes ask that I'm curious about, do you feel like you're part of a Gestalt community, or is it more a sense of family, an institutional home, or how do you situate yourself regarding the Gestalt community, or what is that for you? Or does it even make sense as a concept?
Absolutely. I very much feel a part of the Gestalt community. Not the entire Gestalt community, because there are clearly clusters, and there are some that are linguistically isolated. There are some that are isolated because they don't want to be in contact with others. For the most part, my central Gestalt community is the Gatler community, which is international, because it's comprised of people from all over the world. We have 30 different countries usually represented, 25 to 30. And people come back 5, 6, 8 years. And 80% of them come back, which I'm really very proud of, for a 2-week program of 12 days. And, you know, it's costly as well for people to come back. 80% people are voting with their feet. So the Gatler community to me is primarily the international community from that program, from our ongoing program here in LA. We have an ongoing 6-weekend series, and we have another ongoing 4-week series in Seattle. Those people, and that's the hub of the Gestalt community for me. And then just outside of that hub is AAGT, which I have much less contact than I do with the other people that I was just talking about. And then just outside of that would be EAGT. So those are, and even GANS, although that's more remote from down under in Australia and New Zealand. So yes, the Gatler community is very important to me. It's probably my major identification with any community is the Gestalt community, mostly organized around Gatler, which is a very textured and wide and deep group of people.
Yes. Okay. Well, another question that I have is how you would say, if you want to speak to this, it's not necessarily a relevant category to everyone, but how have you experienced your gendered self or yourself as a man in the Gestalt world or in these different communities over the years?
that changes. It changes with age, and it changes with era. Uh, for example, nowadays, in this era, there's quite a bit of interest, and appropriately, I think, about social identity, social politics, identity politics, white privileged older male. And I think that those things are really important. I also think they sometimes get abused and used as a baseball bat. But there certainly is some reality to that. And the place of women, I think, is pretty good in Gestalt therapy compared to the larger culture. It's not great in Gestalt therapy, but it's pretty damn good. I mean, we live in a patriarchal society. So you know damn well it's not the women that made up the rules and the traditions, unless the men allowed them to. So those issues now are much more figural. They were always in the background, but now they're much more figural. I mean, a long time ago, 40, 50 years ago, a client, it wouldn't be uncommon to a client to say, may I ask how old you are? Nobody does that anymore. But if somebody was in their mid-50s, you know, does this kid have any idea of what I'm talking about? It had to do with age, and it had to do with experience. Nobody asks me that anymore. Now, and I'm sure people would have those same questions with a 25 or 30-year-old therapist today. So that one is more, the metric is how old are you? And can you understand me? And et cetera. And the other is more the era of what's figural. So yes, being a white older male and having been around in Gestalt therapy for a long time, I recognize that gives me probably, well, not probably, it gives me a larger potential for impact than somebody who is 25 and maybe a woman, maybe of color, but any of the minorities that aren't white, male, and older. So I want to be mindful of that, but I also don't want to hold back and pretend in the service of not being accused of using it in a pejorative way.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, and I appreciate the space that you do take. I've never actually experienced you as a domineering or invasive or abusive older white man in my personal experience with you.
Yeah, I'm fine with difference. I don't need to change people. What I'm not fine with is if they want to have a change on me. I want to let my difference and your difference stand, and then I'm interested in engaging. But I'm not interested in a tug of war of whose view of reality is going to prevail. That just goes to conflict.
Yes. Well, maybe running with that a bit, what would you say has been one of your greatest challenges? It can be a theme or it can be a moment, but challenges that you've run up with or against in the Gestalt world.
One was both a challenge and a turning point, a good turning point. And I've told this story a few times. I was working as therapist in a training group that Fritz and Jim Simkin were both there. And I was working in the middle with the client, and I couldn't help peripherally seeing Fritz and Jim. And it was terrible because whatever I did, they would not very subtly indicate their reaction. So Jim would go like he's going to vomit, and Fritz would be beaming. And then a few minutes later, Fritz would actually be putting his head under the lampshade and or covering his eyes, and Jim would be beaming. And it was the probably most important point of time in my training when I was watching both of them and working, and finally I got annoyed. And I said, will you two shut the fuck up? Tell me afterwards what you think. And to my shock, they both smiled. And I went on and worked, and I stopped. They weren't in my figural foreground anymore. They receded in the background from my point of view. So it was a pivotal moment. It was a true aha experience about not trying to please either of them, but surrendering to, I can please me and I can get their input afterwards and consider that, but I don't want to be changing course all along, going back and forth because he's smiling and he's puking. That was the event. But I'm trying to recall the rest of the question because there was,
it was what the challenges were. I mean, either clinically, personally, organizationally, what challenges have you run up against?
The challenge right now, which is a huge challenge to me, is how do we make Gestalt therapy relevant with all the wonderful things that we have to some really crucial larger field issues. Malcolm Parlett's book, The Future Sense, talking about global warming, talking about immigration and migration, talking about governments moving to the right in many countries, talking about climate change. I mean, how do we make those larger field issues affect all of us? But the other side of the dilemma is that people coming in for psychotherapy are not interested to being recruited to be thinking about those larger field office. And, you know, that's not what they came for. So that it's not that global warming is not important, but I want to talk to you about my fight with my wife. And they have a right to do that. So the dilemma is, how do you bring in larger field issues that affect all of us, but they're not so immediate, direct, and in your face that you recognize that it's affecting you immediately? That's the challenge. And I've been talking to Malcolm about it and trying to come up with in our summer program to organize one of our theory tracks. We usually have 4 or 5 different theory tracks that people can choose from, to create a theory track about how to do that. Because many people are interested in that happening, but there's not a lot of how to do that. How to include that in training, and then how to include that in therapy. Because otherwise we're just insulated in some kind of place that may work well here, but it's the larger level of organization that's going to kill the planet or kill the species. And these are real things, and it's not something that's going to happen thousands of years from now. The scientists tell us we have about 10 years, if we really get to it, to turn it around. And even that may be optimistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is definitely a challenge. It's a collective challenge.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And what would you like to do with that? I mean, you talk about working with Malcolm, organizing this, setting up those tracks. But what else would you like to do with Gestalt, out of Gestalt? I mean, you say it's the 50th coming up.
Yeah. Well,
and then
I have both a macro and a micro wish list. And I'm putting that in quotes, macro and micro. The micro one is I really want to have an effect on how couples therapy is viewed and how people practice couples therapy. But that's the micro. The macro is much more grandiose, that I really want to affect the culture on relationships. So rather than therapy fixing something that's been screwed up because Act One organized relationships in ways that create the difficulties in Act Two, and therapy focuses on Act Two, I want to go back to the psychoeducational part of affecting the culture in how primary relationships and marriage are viewed primarily, or in a very crisp way, to move from a fusion model of two become one to a connection model, where you have two people who are in connection, meaning contact and withdrawal, which allows them to deal with what I referenced before, the basic human dilemma of how to be connected to an other and maintain a self. A fusion model doesn't allow that. So what we typically say and call some workshops, two become one and then there are none. You have a divorce rate of 55% for first marriages, 75% for second marriages. It's easier the second time. You've done that before, you survived. But that's only the surface. If you look at the 45% who stay married and you check, and what you find out is many of them are what we call the secretly miserably married. They're people who stay together, but it's not because it's mutually nourishing. They stay together because they're terrified to be alone, or they stay together for religious purposes, or they stay together for financial reasons, or they stay together for the kids, or they stay together to avoid social stigma. Those are not the reasons they got married. So they stay married, and instead of a rupture and explosion into divorce, they do an implosion into surrendering, the secretly miserably married, depressed, angry, alcohol, drugs, acting out, affairs, I mean, all kinds of stuff. So there's something fundamentally off with the model that doesn't fit what people need today. It probably worked. I mean, it did work for us to survive as a species a very long time ago, tens of thousands of years ago. The fusion model today is lethal. So that's the grandiose.
Yeah, I usually think that the fusion model probably worked wonderfully when we all died before 50. And now we have a lot more time to have to survive what we get into.
Way before 50.
When I hear you, yeah, and when I hear you, if we're not talking about marriage, if we're talking about being married into a capitalist productive system, I could almost take exactly what you said and just repeat it. I mean, we get in and then we don't know how to get out. And it's a lot of the same models of the root causes of everyone's unhappiness.
But
being stuck in a system that we don't know how to negotiate with.
Well, you're not allowed to negotiate because you go in misrepresenting yourself. You go in following the stencil of how you're supposed to be as a man or a husband or a woman or a wife or a girlfriend or a live-in or whatever. But you go in with stencils and they're not who you are. So if you're really good at that, which would be unfortunate, then you're in a relationship that only works when you're not there, which rather defeats the purpose of a primary relationship. It's no longer just about survival. You don't need a primary relationship to survive anymore. Back in the day, you did. So that's the macro, the grandiose. But it's very much there for me.
Yes, I appreciate that, and I'm interested to see what you do with that.
Well, I better hurry up.
I'll be keeping up. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else out of these things that you haven't really touched on. but and almost where you said right now sort of comes back to the first thing you said, which is about the ability to become yourself,
Yeah.
which is what Fritz and Jim gave you. And now it sounds like you're finding a way to help other people to recover that same ability.
Yeah. And when you're yourself, then you can fairly quickly find out who you're compatible with. I don't mean exactly the same, but that your range, because you don't stay the same every day, I don't stay the same every day, but your range and the other person's range, there's enough overlap that the package is nourishing. It's not perfect in any relationship. Sometimes you get hurt, sometimes you get angry, but is there the foundation and the support to repair that and to sustain that and build the resilience? That not to make it work by being different than I am. And simply put, you can never find out if you're compatible unless you show up authentically in the first place.
Yes. I don't have anything to add to that. I would say yes.
Thank you. I'm glad. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not my place. So is there anything that you would like to add?
I appreciate the opportunity to be talking about these things. No, I can't think of anything that I would like to add or need to add. I mean, I could add a whole lot, but I think I hit on a lot of things that are important and central to me. So I'm pleased. Yeah. And I want to thank you and Kamala for doing this.
No, thank you. Thank you for being a part of this. And why don't we leave it here?
Okay.
Does that sound good?
That sounds fine. And now I didn't hear any garbage trucks or